I'm here today with Matt Graeber. We're kind of testing out a new format for Atomic Friday. We've been on hiatus for a little while we've sort of been thinking through how we want to do Atomic Fridays moving forward. And we've landed on a pre-recorded format that we'll do some of the time. Like we may also do live Atomic Fridays as well. But like for the first few, we're gonna pre-record them and see how it goes, get feedback, and then maybe continue to do those periodically moving forward. So today what we're going to do though is we're going to run through our so we released our threat detection report, which is Red Canary's sort of annual report based on like basically pull all the data we have associated with all of our confirmed threats for the whole year. We create a list of like the top specific threats we saw and then the top techniques we saw. And for the technique side, each technique in that top 10 has a corresponding testing section, right? So the makeup of that section is like, we'll use, since we're going to talk through Lsass as one of our techniques today, Lsass memory, we'll use that example. So there's a section in there that's like, hey, why do adversaries use Lsass memory? There's a section in there about how you can gather visibility to observe adversaries who are leveraging Lsass memory. And then there's a section on like specific detection analytics that will help you alert when an adversary is using Lsass memory. After all of that, though, we have a testing section. And the purpose is like, if you followed all of that advice, then you can run this test, and the test will, one, show you what these behaviors look like in the wild, at least what one example of these behaviors look like in the wild. And two, it'll like let you know if you've configured everything correctly. So today we're gonna run through those tests, right? We're gonna run them. We're gonna look at what they look like in Sysmon. What I missed? Did I get everything there, Matt?
Yeah, you got everything. Yeah, so let me run everyone through the configuration that I'm going to be using to run these tests through and validate what optics, if any, we might be able to capture for these tests, for these various techniques. So this is what I will often prefer to do when I'm like serving in the role of like a detection engineer who is like just initially trying to wrap my brain around what, if any, relevant optics might exist for a technique. So what this configuration does is, by default, it logs nothing. And as I go, and I'll kind of talk through some of this, as I develop hypotheses about what data sources might be relevant for the technique that I'm testing, I may just individually turn on some of those event sources. I could certainly just turn this thing on full blast and collect all the things. I want to respect everyone's time, and I just want to be able to work through these events as quickly as I can. But that certainly would be another approach that I might take. Say if I wasn't quite as confident in those hypotheses about like what data sources may already be available. Like, let's say I just had no clue what data sources were available. So why not just turn everything on full blast, run the tests, see what's generated, and then do a diff of like what, like from right before I ran the test to right after, what events were generated when that full blast was on. That's absolutely another approach that I would take. It's just a little more time consuming. So the examples that we'll be testing today are, we're going to start with Lsass memory dumping, move on to MSHTA, and then the renaming of system utilities, all three of which are in the threat detection report. And I will admit these are relatively contrived examples. Your mileage may vary as in regards to like how practical these may be to actual attackers or red teamers. I will say that this first one here, the Lsass memory one, is super applicable to like real world adversaries. And considering it can be run in this one-liner, I definitely like to focus a bit on that. But I think all three of these are important, and I'll explain the rationale for like why we think each one of these is so particularly relevant and important to detect as I go along.
Yeah, to underscore the point you were just making, we have at least 3 pieces of content that that explicitly mention this run DLL 32 plus this com svcs.dll and then this mini dump functionality in the command line. Like, I think we've got 2 blogs about it, and then we obviously mentioned it this year in the threat detection report.
Yeah, and we wouldn't be including these things in the threat detection report if they weren't relevant and being used extremely prevalently in the wild. So some of these are contrived, but extremely relevant and important to establish some sense of detection coverage for each one of these. So if it's cool with you, Brian, I think I'll go ahead and start diving into the Lsass memory dumping technique.
Absolutely, let's do it.
Cool. All right, so let me get this queued up in PowerShell. And there's no necessity that this run in an elevated PowerShell prompt, which this is. Well, it does need to run in an elevated context because otherwise we wouldn't have access to dump Lsass memory. But the reason, just for the sake of convenience, I'm running this in PowerShell is so that I can use PowerShell to dynamically resolve the process identifier for the Lsass process. Otherwise, if we were doing this in a standard command prompt, it would just be one additional step to either automate or manually obtain the process ID for Lsass. So I just want to get a nice little one-liner here. So PowerShell does that lifting for me. All right, so let me explain what we're doing here. So run DLL 32 is designed to invoke a DLL export function. Typically, what it's designed to do is if you are an application developer and you want to have an export function in your DLL, be specifically interface with run DLL 32, there's a particular way that you have to design your export function. And there's quite a large handful of these functions that are built into Windows and designed to be properly executed with run DLL 32. So my pretty crude understanding of the mini dump export function in com svcs.dll is that it is indeed one of those export functions that was explicitly designed to function effectively with run DLL 32. So what's going to happen here is we're telling run DLL 32, hey, I want to execute this function, which takes 3 arguments. The first being the process identifier of the process whose memory space you want to dump, the location and file name of the dump file that the mini dump export function is going to write to disk, and then what kind of dump do you want to take? I don't recall what all the options are, but for the sake of simplicity and maximum flexibility for working with an Lsass process dump, which is going to contain credentials stored within process memory, the easiest thing to do is just to get a full process memory dump. But we have to specify where, like, the actual DLL that implements that function, which in this case is com svcs.dll. So without further ado, I could quickly validate that that was successfully generated, which it looks like it was. So that's easy enough, like super easily weaponizable by attackers using built-in utilities. I didn't have to drop anything to the system. It's all built in, and I get my Lsass dump. So I could, theoretically, surreptitiously compress that and exfil it over the network. I've got lots of options at this point for doing offline credential dumping with a tool like Mimikatz or anything else that might be able to work with these memory dump files.
What is this ls command you just ran? So I understand that you checked to see when that file was created and confirmed that the dump file was created at 11:16. But what is that ls command?
Yeah, this was just a sanity check to validate that the lsass.dump file was successfully created in PowerShell. ls in PowerShell is an alias for the get child item commandlet. Brian, any ideas why that error surfaced?
Not off the top of my head.
So I suspect Defender is running and it flagged this. I could probably validate that.
I should have known that, considering the fact that every time I do anything with Invoke Atomic, I end up angering my Windows Defender and my VM.
I'm not seeing anything right now. I did run this demo earlier. Oh, wait, no. There we go. Yeah, it definitely is.
The exact minute that you created that file.
There we go. So yeah, there's a signature for this. So even though like we're not dropping any malware to the system, like I think it's pretty cool that Defender is triggering on this lulbin execution. So that's cool.
And it's like ultimately a good thing, right? Like in this context, it's like, you could say it's annoying, but it like Windows Defender is blocking a thing that probably should never happen on like legitimately on an endpoint.
Exactly. And I couldn't be more pleased about that. So that's awesome. All right. So let's start thinking about what data sources might be relevant to trying to detect this, other than blindly relying upon Defender to catch this after the fact. So some things that stand out to me, like one, I'd probably like to have like process creation events be surfaced for the execution of run DLL32, so that I might be able to discern legitimate invocation of run DLL32 versus this shady stuff that's going on. All right, so that's number one, because with that process logging, I would theoretically get this full command line context, which is great. Some other potentially relevant things, because this is dumping Lsass process memory, my assumption here is that in order to achieve that, you're going to have to obtain a handle to Lsass to be able to read its process memory. So because we're working with Sysmon, I think I'll want to enable process access events to see if an event is raised for obtaining a handle to Lsass, so that I could attribute the process that obtained the handle to Lsass effectively. Some other nice to have things potentially would be like file rights. For example, this dump file being written may or may not want to have that kind of context. And then also module loads is another potential. I certainly would be curious to know under what legitimate scenarios com.svcs.dll is loaded. Like, is it an outlier? I suspect it is, but my assumptions are always shattered all the time, like in detection engineering. I feel it's a valid assumption that it should not be common to be loaded in the context of run DLL32, but I'd like to be able to validate that. So having that those module load events, I think, would be pretty relevant. So let me go into my configuration here, and all I'm going to do is just swap these out and flip the include to exclude to like turn on the fire hose of these events. So I'm just going to capture all process creations. Let's see, what else did I want? Process access. I'll capture those. File creation. I'll include those. and the other was image load. Let's capture that. All right, save that out. And update my configuration. I'm using Sysmon 64. Okay, cool. So I'm going to run this again and see what comes out on the other side. Okay. So I'm currently in the Sysmon event log. Refresh. Whoa. Yeah, we definitely turned that on full blast, didn't we? So a ton of process access events. Why don't I go to the earliest events and see what might be relevant here. So yeah, this is going to be super freaking noisy, as you can see. But there's the relevant process creation. So what stands out to me as extremely relevant are things like process command line, the image path. I don't expect this to deviate from here too much, or say like I would also maybe expect malicious usage of run-dll32 to execute from the syswow 64 directory if it's executing in a 32-bit context. The reason the image path and file name are interesting to me is because that's related, potentially related to the third technique, which we'll be testing. If an attacker decided to rename and relocate these lull bins for the purposes of evasion. We can detect that. We get sufficient context to be able to see that. But we'll cover that in the third example. I wonder if I could quickly filter through some of this stuff. Yeah, here we go. So glad I was able to find that quickly. Here is the process access event for, let's see. No, this is PowerShell obtaining a handle to run DLL32. I'm wanting to find run DLL32 obtaining a handle to Lsass. So I would hope, yeah.
Is that event collecting the execution of the test itself from PowerShell? Is that why that it's PowerShell grabbing a handle to Lsass or
Yeah,
run DLL32
good question.
together?
Yep, exactly. Okay, so now we're starting to see some process access from run DLL32 being the source. I would have come better prepared with some good filters for these Sysmon rules to weed through some of these excessive process access rules, which, like, as you can see, like, this is expected to be extremely noisy and you're going to want to filter accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great illustration of how alerting can get out of hand quick with like simple, small configuration changes.
Yeah. But I mean, I could still walk through what I would expect to see, which would be the source image of run DLL32 and and the relevant target image, which is going to be lsass.exe. And what's also relevant is the granted access field. What you'll often see would be, we saw one, it was like one FFFFF, that corresponds to process all access. You can definitely nerd out quite a bit with breaking out those process access bits. For example, like as a defender, I'm particularly interested in any potential access to Lsass where read access is requested. Actually, that's really one of the primary things I'm interested in. you can just request read access and maybe a couple other access rights to request the bare minimum access necessary to read Lsass process memory. Process all access, or that one FFFFF access value, is sort of the lazy way of just requesting all the things, when really, like, that's not even necessary for an attacker. So yeah, that's what I'd be looking for in process access rules. Let me clean this up a little bit. And since we've covered process access, I'm just going to turn that fire hose off for now. Update that configuration, clear my log, run this again, and see if we have some cleaner output. Ah, there's that prompt there.
Tinder got you again.
Good job. Good job. Ooh, still pretty noisy with the image load events. But these two are pretty straightforward. The thing that, again, I mentioned I would be very interested in is for any image loads of com svcs.dll. My question would be, is it common or expected in any way for it to load in the context of run DLL 32? More broadly, is that DLL loaded commonly in the first place in the context of other processes? I'm certainly curious to know, because ideally as a detection engineer, I want to start by casting as wide of a net as possible, and then gradually narrow that scope as I go along and have to realistically filter out some stuff in my detection logic. Okay. Let's see, what else would be relevant? Let's see, I think, honestly, I think that's good enough for now. We certainly would get a file write event for this being written. As a detection engineer, I'm potentially reluctant to like naively assume that I could get like some high fidelity detection coverage out of file mods, aside from getting some easy wins. So for example, like you'll see a common file extension for process memory dumps to have the .dmp extension. Now, is that an actual requirement? Well, it's easy enough to test. So that's why I like having a really easy test to work with, and then just tweak certain aspects of it to validate assumptions that I might be making as a detection engineer.
This is interesting because I was thinking about this like kind of from the opposite angle, and I was going to ask, like, how often do you see a .dmp file legitimately, but you then flipped it on its head by pointing out that you could just change it to a text file?
And you will see it legitimately quite often, like whenever any process will crash, Werfault will come around that service, and depending on how your OS is configured, will automatically take a process memory dump. Or if you have a blue screen, like you're going to get like a full kernel memory dump, and it by default will have that that file extension.
And you could arbitrarily rename Lsass, right? You don't have to dump it to like some obvious lsass.dmp file, right? You could call that like mat.dmp if you wanted to.
Yeah, I could call it foo.txt. Like I could really get creative here. Another thing, and here's a good lead into the third example, would be, what if I did this? I copied com svcs.dll to foo.bar. Like, would this work? We shall see. Let me rename this so I can validate that we get like a new file for this if it actually worked. Indeed, it did. So as a detection engineer, I'm acutely interested in all of the aspects of the, I would say in this case, the procedure. So the technique that we're talking about is Lsass memory dumping. The procedure, like the particular way in which that technique is being invoked, is via run DLL, com_svcs.dll, the mini dump export function. So of course I'd want to get 100% coverage of all variations of the Lsass dumping technique. That's an ideal that we should all strive for, but we live in a reality. And if we want to gauge our level of coverage for the technique, we need to start small and start with what we know. And what we know is this is one common way to do it. So let's consider this to be one particular procedure. I'd like to focus on coverage of this particular procedure. And I can start to wrap my head around coverage by understanding what an attacker has explicit control over, so that I can design the most resilient detection analytics as possible. So one thing that I know you can't modify is the mini dump export function name. Now that does rely upon some assumptions, be it, yes, you could technically modify that in the DLL itself, like in the binary. It would certainly be up to the attacker as to like forming the rationale for wanting to do that in the first place. That would invalidate the signature of the DLL, and at that point would kind of cease to be like a lull bin, I guess. So given the assumption that an attacker didn't want to modify the binary, the thing that is extremely consistent here is mini dump in the command line is not going to change if we go along with our assumptions that an attacker won't modify that binary. Cool. So I think we beat that dead horse. And let's move on to the next one. So MSHTA, this is, I mean, attackers abuse the crap out of this. Like we see this used all the time, and so many variations of it too. Whether an attacker is calling like MSHTA and just pointing it directly to a URI to download and directly invoke it, or if they're embedding their their script content in line, as is the case here. So very brief background about MSHTA. What it allows an attacker to do is execute any Windows script host code. So when I refer to Windows script host, I'm referring primarily to VBScript and JScript code. Out of the box, VBScript and JScript don't allow you to do quite as much as you'd be able to do with, say, PowerShell, where like there's really nothing you can't do in PowerShell. So what we'll often see in the wild is MSHTA like using like VBScript or JScript to just like call PowerShell, and maybe like PowerShell would download and execute a thing. We've seen some attackers, mostly like more red teamers, use something like jamesforshaw's.net to JScript to break out of the inherent limitations of VBScript and JScript and get full code execution in the context of those script interpreters. So we'll see that as well. So attackers can be super flexible here. But this is relatively common from what we'll see, like super simple, straightforward stuff like use it to execute PowerShell as a stager to download and execute further payloads. So again, while this is contrived, it's actually very realistic that you'd see something similar to this in the wild. So just to show you that this does indeed work. That's what we see there in the output. And so my data source hypotheses would be process execution. Like I want to get the full context of what executed. Like I want to know that MSHTA executed, relevant command line context. Potentially interesting could be like module loads. I might like to know any process that loads like vbscript.dll or jscript.dll. Now, in reality, that's going to be very noisy, but I've only learned that that's very noisy by querying like across the fleet and our organizations, like just how common it is, which it really is. Now, not related to MSHTA, but the fact that this is launching PowerShell, we could dig into PowerShell logs as potentially interesting and perhaps get some context about the parent process that called PowerShell is potentially interesting. So let me tweak this a little bit, and I think I'm just gonna log process creation in this case. Okay, any others? Nope, that's it. Okay. Update my configuration. I'm going to clear this out, run it again, and see what we get. Okay, that's pretty clean. So let's start with the first event here. Okay, so we got MSHTA running, and we get the full command line context, which is nice. We get parent command context as well, which is pretty cool. What do we have next? So we have PowerShell running. We get the command line context for that. And importantly, we get the parent context included, which is pretty cool. Now, imagine that what was executed in PowerShell was just like a stager, like a download cradle that reached out to like say some paste bin URI and executed some follow-on payload. It'd be great to get like the URI that it reached out to, but we wouldn't have the context of what was actually executed unless we turned on script block logging. So the other data source we'd be interested in is here in the PowerShell event log. And we're going to be looking at event ID 4104. So let me filter out those events. And there we get the relevant context of what executed. And again, as I mentioned, if this was a download cradle, you would see the context of what was downloaded and executed and passed on to like invoke expression. So PowerShell script block logging is amazing. I recommend everyone turn it on.
So in your Sysmon operational logs,
Yes.
like why do you think the Lsass test created so many process creation events, whereas the MSHTA test didn't? Do you think that's a byproduct of your Sysmon configuration changes, or is it a byproduct of the test itself?
It's a byproduct of the Sysmon configuration. When that executed, well, like we saw the evidence of Defender kicking in and booting the dump file, and we also saw a ton of evidence of that in the form of like process access events. But you may have seen the overwhelming majority of those were not related to run DLL32 or like Lsass process access. So the best thing for me to have done in that example would be to just filter on and only include events for the purpose of this demonstration, just PowerShell.exe events, RunDLL32 events, and Lsass events. And that would definitely whittle down the number of events. Like there'd still be a solid chunk of like image load events for the common things like NTDLL, kernel 32, but you would also see like com svcs.dll, and even in the case of the evasion that I was doing, you'd see an image load for foo.bar, which is pretty interesting.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the last test here. So rename system utilities. Pretty straightforward. Attackers love to do this. And fortunately, if you have the right detection optics and are doing the appropriate baselining, this thing is super easy to detect. Generally, very high fidelity, relatively low volume detections, and we catch all kinds of great evil with this detection logic, which I'll walk through once we start looking at the data. So what we're going to do in this example's rename PowerShell.exe and write it to cwindows temp notepad.exe. And then we're just executing notepad with an encoded command. So it's just PowerShell renamed. So let's see what that looks like. Oops. Okay, so under the hood, this encoded command is just calling write host hello from PowerShell. So this would definitely break a lot of naive detection logic, right? If the assumption is that, say, your detection logic is looking for like evidence of encoded commands along with PowerShell.exe, right? So let's talk about the relevant data sources. So let's look for the notepad process executing. Here we go. All right, so here's what you want to pay attention to. This executed from the following path. We knew this, notepad.exe. I forget what version of Sysmon this was introduced in, but it was relatively recent, where process start events include the binary metadata, like the version info resource, which is embedded as a resource in the binary. So note the original file name embedded within that binary resource is PowerShell.exe. So here's that opportunity potentially as detection engineers to baseline both the expected file name and expected file paths for known abused lol bins, right? So PowerShell being an obvious candidate to do this baselining for. You would ask yourselves, okay, like where are all the realistic locations for PowerShell.exe to be located? I can think of two right off the bat. In, where were we? Windows System 32, Windows PowerShell, and Windows syswow 64, Windows PowerShell, PowerShell.exe. So those would be the two obvious ones. And I expect the file name in those directories to be PowerShell.exe. And the original file name is PowerShell.exe. So the detection logic would work as such. If a process started that has an original file name of PowerShell.exe, executes outside of the baseline directory or the baseline file name create an alert. And so it's an or, not an and. So like an attacker could have moved PowerShell.exe to see Windows temp PowerShell.exe. You still might get the benefit of like that existing naive detection logic, but maybe not. Who knows? And it would still be potentially valuable to know that PowerShell.exe is executing outside of the expected directory where it should be running from. But to also alert when the expected file name does not match. That is going to be the more likely relevant example of when you'd want to surface this to a SOC analyst to triage that event.
Yeah, I like this like philosophically because it's applicable way, way, way beyond this specific example, right? Like the blog we just published a couple weeks ago about like ransomware extortion adversaries using rclone and megasync to upload files to external storage services, the exact same logic, right? Like look for a process that is named whatever. Well, look for a process that's named anything that's other than rsync, but with that original file name that is rsync, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So if you're doing this baselining, this particular evasion activity, while it is really effective at evading naive detection logic, creates its own like very loud high signal detection signal just by doing this, by doing the renaming and executing outside of the context of the expected directory and file name. And the inclusion of that binary metadata, the version info resource, like original file name, is what empowers us as defenders to do the baselining, but to actually validate that baseline in execution.
And is it possible to change that original file name? And in doing so, does that sort of go back to the point you made earlier where like at that point, you're arguably not using a low bin anymore?
Exactly. Yeah, you're ceasing to use the built-in utility and you're almost in effect like introducing your own malware into the system. So yes, like the opportunity exists. You're going to invalidate the signature. And really that comes down to like, as far as the attacker is concerned, does this increase my risk? And is it worth the effort? Do I have the tooling to automate this? Does the tooling that automate this create its own possible detection signal? Like, is that extra mile of evasion worth it to me? These are great questions to ask, and we could certainly get into speculation rabbit holes. Again, we as detection engineers, we have to live in reality and define the scope of our detection logic and continually refine that scope and make certain assumptions about our logic and be confident in the scope of our detection logic. And if our information changes, like in the field, if we're getting threat intel to indicate like, yeah, attackers are starting to ramp up and actually change this binary metadata, invalidating signatures, like, okay, game on. Like, we'll just have to rescope things and think about that particular evasion and focus on detecting that particular evasion. So it's fun to ask these questions because like the deeper into the rabbit hole we go, hopefully the quicker we can like kind of pull ourselves out of and like really draw a solid line of scope around what we really want to focus on. But yeah, it's a great question.
Importantly too, like even if they are doing this, it doesn't necessarily invalidate the importance of being able to detect when they just change the presented name, right? Like if
Oh my
adversary
God,
A
yes.
is
Great
changing the
point.
original name, like adversaries B, C, and D are all still doing this method of masquerading.
Yep. Yeah, there is no sense of perfection here. And like, we must never let perfect be the enemy of awesome. Like, if we can establish really good coverage against like how attackers are realistically abusing things in the wild, I want that, because going down those rabbit holes and striving for that like 99% solution is awesome, but that comes at a cost. It comes at the expense of establishing that 80% solution for other techniques that are actively being abused in the wild in relatively lazy fashions that we want to have good coverage for. So that's a great question. Yeah, like looping back to here, like an attacker may be interested in like renaming and relocating run DLL 32 in the same way that I relocated the DLL and called it foo.bar. So there's detection signal for all of these things. But like, I'll always remain interested in what an attacker has direct control over and may realistically not have quite as much control over. So in the case of this Lsass memory dumping procedure, mini dump in the command line, I'm really going to be keying in on that in particular, and probably wouldn't expect to see mini dumping command line instances in other legitimate use cases. Maybe, but that's easy enough to filter out. I don't expect that to be prevalent in legitimate use cases. So that's all I got.
Great. Well, we hope this was useful. As we said at the outset, this is kind of going to be maybe a version of the format that we may continue to do moving forward with Atomic Fridays. Like, obviously, if you found this super interesting and you think you'd want us to do more stuff like this, just let us know, like in the Atomic Slack, or email us or hit us up on Twitter. Matt, like, thanks so much for doing this. Thanks for your time. As for everybody who happens to watch this, like, thank you for your time as well. And I hope everybody found this super useful. I definitely learned a lot. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions, Brian. Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for your time.